Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. Before we begin, a reminder to support me on Patreon. There are a lot of awesome exclusives you can only find there, like bonus episodes, tier lists, and more. Your support helps ensure that the podcast can keep going, and I appreciate it. Click the Patreon link in the description to check it out. And also, AF Out is now on YouTube. We're working hard to get our backlog of episodes uploaded, so if you like having these visuals with your content, check out the AF Out YouTube channel. The link is in the description of the podcast, and if you're watching this, you can just subscribe right down below. Click the subscription button. And now, back to the show. Throughout history, humans have sacrificed each other for a lot of reasons. Sometimes, humans will sacrifice themselves or kill another for food. Survival cannibalism, right? One of my favorites. I've talked about that probably too much at this point. But human sacrifice isn't always for sustenance. It also happens sometimes for religious reasons. And today, I want to go over one of the more fascinating civilizations in history, in my opinion, and how they engaged in regular human sacrifice: the Inca Empire and their sacrificial mummies. From 1438 to 1533, the Inca Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, held power over a significant portion of the Andes Mountains in South America. Their empire stretched over 2,500 miles from the southern borders of today's Chile to about the southern borders of today's Colombia to about halfway down modern Chile. Anywhere between 6 to 14 million people lived within its borders, and it was by far the largest civilization in the world at its peak, at least in that period of time. Now, the Inca are famous for a lot of things: their unique style of architecture and stone walls that didn't use mortar, their engineering, despite not even having the wheel or access to iron. How about Machu Picchu, right? Or the Quechua language. So much South American Andean culture today comes from the Inca. But there was one aspect of their civilization which seems pretty out there for us in the modern world, and luckily for me, it's prime AF-out material. Because the Inca, as part of their religious beliefs, used to sacrifice children to their gods and leave their bodies to mummify at the tops of mountains. And it wasn't just children who were mummified. Important figures in the Inca world were mummified as a way of showing honor and respect, keeping them around as mummies to help bridge the gap between the living and the dead. So today, I want to talk about the Inca. First, we'll review the basics of the Inca Empire and talk about all the things that make them awesome. And then we'll get into their religious beliefs and why they sacrificed their own to honor the gods. Finally, we'll take a look at the Inca mummies, those of sacrificed children and of the honorable dead, to get a good sense of how the Inca carried on the traditions of those who came before, because the oldest mummies in the world, that we've found at least, come from the Andes Mountains. So let's get started. Though the Inca Empire's years are from 1438 to 1533, the Quechua-speaking people, who eventually became the Inca, have been around in the Andes since the late 12th, early 13th centuries. So that's the late 1100s, early 1200s. Now, because I've mentioned it, let's talk about Quechua for a minute. Quechua is a language that still exists in South America today. It's an indigenous language spoken by over 13 million people in the Andes Mountains, ranging from Colombia down to Chile. So basically where the Inca Empire was. There are a ton of different dialects, but regardless, Quechua as a language family is the most widely spoken indigenous language in the Americas, both north and south. The original Quechua, the one spoken by the Inca, was only a spoken language, not a written one. This means that we have no Inca Quechua texts. The only records we have about the Inca are oral records, Spanish records from conquest, archaeological evidence, and then the quipu. Though the Inca may not have had a written language, that didn't mean they had no way of keeping records. Enter the quipu. It was a system of knotted strings that was used to count numbers and have been found primarily in Inca storehouses. Based on archaeological evidence and oral testimony, we have a pretty good idea of how the quipu worked. And quipu, by the way, is the Quechua word for knot, as in knotted strings. Knot with a K, K-N-O-T. The number of strings, the number of knots in a string, their placement, their color, their spacing, it all conveyed different pieces of information. We have a basic general understanding about what those numbers represent, and we believe it was used to keep track of storehouse numbers, population, even calendar days. But again, our written evidence of it is pretty much non-existent. It's also worth noting that the Inca didn't invent the quipu. It had been used by Andean societies for generations before the Inca took power. This is common for pre-Columbian American societies, both in Central and South America. They adapted and took things from each other as one society invaded and replaced the other. I went over this briefly as it applies to the Aztecs taking Mayan stuff like their deities, but it's a Patreon-only video for my Explorer and Cannibal tier members, so join today if you want cool content like that. Anyway, back to the Inca. They were a Quechua-speaking people who built their capital city, Cusco, in modern-day Peru, sometime around the year 1200. From there, they engaged in territorial expansion, growing stronger, challenging and defeating their enemies, and taking their lands. It's what most civilizations do as a way to establish power and legitimacy. By 1438, they had conquered their enemies and established an empire. An empire differs from other forms of government in that an empire controls various peoples, states, and countries potentially within its borders. So not everyone in the Inca Empire was an Inca. They ruled over various peoples and communities, speaking all kinds of different languages. Think of it like an umbrella. The Inca Empire was the umbrella, and it covered and, sheltered from the rain, I suppose, all kinds of different people and communities and all that sort of stuff. So as such, not everyone in the empire spoke the same language, Quechua. This is true in common of different empires throughout history. If we think about Rome, right, not everyone who was incorporated into the Roman Empire was a Roman, or could even be considered a Roman, or spoke the Roman language, Latin, right? The Romans would conquer their enemies, take their lands, incorporate them into the empire, or republic, depending on the year we're talking about here, and then make their new people pay taxes for things like the impressive Roman aqueducts or concrete roads that connected everything together, right? And that's what the Inca did too. They used their massive empire to source labor, goods, and taxes. And with all of that, they did some pretty serious civil engineering. I read one article that called the Inca, quote, Romans of the New World. Now, the Inca road system was pretty intense. It ended up stretching over 25,000 miles long. Some of it was paved, other parts were left as dirt paths, but the thing covered the entirety of their empire, keeping all of their conquered peoples connected to the central hub, the capital city at Cusco. They built really impressive rope bridges, simple suspension bridges that spanned canyons, rivers, you name it. Remember, their empire was on top of a mountain. And because they were on a mountain, they did all of this without the technology of the wheel. Not because they weren't smart enough to develop that technology, but because it wouldn't be super useful to have a wheel on the side of a mountain, right? Now, to harp on how great Inca engineering is, let's talk more about some of their feats. Their walls were made with perfectly fitting rocks. They didn't use mortar, so their walls were like jigsaw puzzles. Each stone was carved to perfectly fit in its space. And it's not because they were crap builders, all right? Their walls were perfectly adapted to the earthquakes that accompany mountain civilizations, because each rock had just a little bit of wiggle room in between them. Not enough to slip in a knife blade, right? Just a tiny little gap. But when an earthquake hit, it could just vibrate in place without the entire structure falling over. For agriculture, another civil engineering feat, because again, they're on a mountain, you can't just plant things on a mountain, gravity, right? They would build up flat plots of land called terraces and plant their root crops on there. The potato, by the way, was first cultivated in the Andes, so we can thank the Andean people for French fries. Thank you. Now, having good infrastructure like this helped them maintain their empire because they could A, keep tabs on their people to help prevent rebellions, B, make sure their people were happy with access to goods and services, and C, maintain proper transportation and communication routes. And that last part, having good transportation, was essential for some of their religious beliefs, particularly when it came time to sacrifice young girls and leave their mummified corpses at the top of a mountain. So let's dig a little deeper then into Inca mythology and religion. Look at this. Ooh. The Inca, like many post-classical civilizations, were polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. And also, like other post-classical civs, their gods were centered around things like the sun, the moon, water, the earth, weather, agriculture, things like fertility, the elements that allow for people to exist and for civilizations to prosper. This is true of most polytheistic faiths, by the way. Now, one of their more important deities was Inti, the sun god, and I really, really appreciate how easy it is to say and spell Inti, I-N-T-I, considering his Central American Aztec counterpart was Huitzilopochtli. I talked a bit about Aztec deities and their human sacrifices in that Patreon subscriber-only video I mentioned, so if you're interested, go watch that. You gotta subscribe for more content. Now, the Inca practiced a lot of rites and rituals in conjunction with their faith, and almost every one of these rituals was accompanied by some sort of sacrifice to honor, respect, and in some cases, nourish their gods. Sacrifices could be a rudimentary style of beer made with fermented maize, which is corn. Sometimes it could be food or llamas, nothing too out of the ordinary, right? We've heard about stuff like that happening in all kinds of cultures. But in some special ceremonies, the sacrifice would be virgins or children. Child sacrifice was known as capacocha, and unfortunately for the children, it was a major part of the Inca religion. It would be done for big stuff, to honor the death of the Sapa Inca, which is the emperor, or maybe to appeal to the gods in times of famine, to ask for divine protection against enemies, or protection against environmental hazards. Remember, they're on top of a mountain, right? Now, most of these earlier societies, including ones in Western Europe and Asia, by the way, would have assumed that natural disasters was a result of angry gods. And this mountain civilization would have dealt with earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, all kinds of stuff. Sacrifices would have been made to appease the gods to try to stop that. But why children? The Aztec would sacrifice prisoners of war, captive enemies. So why didn't the Inca do that? They had to conquer a lot of rival tribes to become a powerful empire, so why not just knock out their enemies that way? Well, it's not just about providing blood like it was for the Aztecs. And in fact, it wasn't bloody at all. The sacrifices weren't torn apart, they weren't gutted, their hearts weren't ripped out of their chest. They would essentially succumb to hypothermia and be sacrificed that way. Sometimes they'd be hit in the back of the head, but it wasn't a bloody spectacle. People didn't gather to watch this big, bloody, violent decapitation of humans, right? It's not that. No, for the Inca, it was about offering the purest beings to their gods in reverence, in respect. And who are the purest? Well, typically, most societies saw virgins and children as the purest. Whether you agree with that or not, that's just the way it was. It was also a huge honor to be chosen as the sacrifice. Children would be specially chosen from across the empire and brought to Cusco, the capital city, to be raised as a future sacrifice. They were given the good life. Fancy clothes, rich diets that included meat, which was not super common in Indian cuisine at the time, gold trinkets, and we know all this, by the way, because we found child sacrifice or sacrificial children. Basically, we found their mummies buried with these trinkets and with these fine clothes and stuff, and we could do food analysis in their stomach and based off of hair samples. Now, once a child was chosen to be sacrificed, they would walk to their designated site and prepare to die. Okay, so which sites are chosen and why? Well, if we consider that children were being sacrificed to the gods, they would go to the places closest to the gods, which are the tops of mountains. Now, I'm going to use one particular girl to illustrate this whole process. She was sacrificed sometime between 1440 and 1480, and we call her La Doncella, or the Maiden. Or sometimes she's known as the Llullaillaco Maiden, named for the volcano she was found on in Chile. Fun fact, Llullaillaco, though currently dormant, is the second highest active volcano in the world. It's about halfway down Chile in the Andes, just about on the border with Argentina. So the Llullaillaco Maiden, I'm just going to call her the Maiden. That's easier. I don't want to keep saying Llullaillaco over and over again. The Maiden was probably around 15 years old. She is incredibly well preserved. Her clothing, made from fine alpaca wool, was still intact when they found her. She was buried with the insignia of Inca royalty given to her when she was housed at Cusco in a special, isolated cloister. Her dark hair, still in perfect condition. In fact, her hair was so well and meticulously braided that it left imprints on her skin after more than 550 years smushed up against her cheek. Her teeth and fingernails were perfectly preserved. She was wearing a feathered headdress, something only worn by the most elite in society, and she was also found buried with little golden llamas and other trinkets. So, based on all of that archaeological evidence, researchers and historians believe that she was one of the Sun Virgins, girls chosen to live a cloistered life that would either become sacrifices, priestesses, or royal wives. She was found in 1999 by an expedition led by American anthropologist and archaeologist Johann Reinhard. He and his team were on the lookout for Inca ritual sacrifice sites, and they discovered the Maiden after only 3 days of searching, so that's pretty successful. But the Maiden wasn't alone. Buried alongside her were a younger boy and a girl. The boy was just named El Niño, the boy, and the girl was coined La Niña del Rayo, or Lightning Girl, because she had a brown stripe across her face that looked like the result of a lightning strike, post-mortem, after death. And of the three, the Maiden was the best preserved. Now, to investigate this discovery even more, scientists did hair analysis. Doing this, they could find out all kinds of things, like what was in their systems, what I mentioned before about what they had been eating and drinking, etc. And they discovered that all three children had coca leaves and maize beer in their systems. Coca leaves, you might be able to guess, is one of the primary ingredients in cocaine. But the leaves themselves, when chewed, serve as a mild stimulant and a part of indigenous medicine. The corn beer, in combination with the presence of coca leaves, suggests that the children were drugged before their deaths. In fact, a wad of coca leaves was still nestled in the maiden's cheeks when they did a scan of her body. This suggests that the children had to be calmed down before their sacrifice. But that makes sense, right? I mean, even if I knew I was meant to be a sacrifice, even if I was honored by that prospect, my family was honored, they were going to get all kinds of promotions within society, even if I willingly walked all the way from Cusco to bloody Llullaillaco, okay? The trip over Inca roads, that would be about 800 miles, 1,300 kilometers. Yeah, I'd probably need to be drugged as well in my final hours. Bit scary. The children didn't have any injuries. They weren't beaten. They weren't stabbed, they didn't have their skulls bashed open, they died peacefully in their sleep, likely of hypothermia. Their bodies were then covered up, post-mortem, with blankets, respectfully. So that tells us, as historians or archaeologists, that people must have been there with the children, right? They must have gone with them to their final destination, which makes sense. A 15-year-old and 2 preteens would probably get lost on an 800-mile journey over the Andes Mountains. Their bodies today, by the way, are on exhibition at the Museum of High Altitude Archaeology in Salta, Argentina. So, if you ever find yourself down in Argentina, go say hi to the Maiden. She's so well preserved, she looks like she only died last week. Seriously, it's scary. And she stays so well preserved, by the way, because she's kept more or less on ice in an oxygen-deprived environment. It's why there are so many Inca mummies found in varying states of decomp. I went over this in my episode on the Mount Everest Rainbow Valley. The cold, low oxygen environments high up in the mountains helps preserve bodies for a lot longer than they would at sea level. That's why mummies are so incredibly important to archaeology. Since there aren't too many Inca records, as their language was spoken and not written, Quechua, finding evidence like this gives us so much information about who they were and how they operated as an empire. Now, for those of you who are good at math and caught this in the beginning of the podcast, you might remember that I said the Inca Empire only lasted from 1438 to 1533. That's not even 100 years, right? So if the Inca were such incredible engineers and administrators capable of defeating their enemies, what happened? Why was their reign over the Andes so short? Well, 3 words: Spaniards, gunpowder, and smallpox. Let's talk about the fall of the Inca, because it's cool, and I want to talk about it. After Christopher Columbus sailed for the New World on behalf of the Spanish, the floodgates were open. Explorers from Spain and Portugal, and later England, Netherlands, and France, started to explore what was later deemed to be a new continent, the Americas. And I have to say this because it bothers me immensely, and I've said it before, I'll say it now, and I'm probably going to say it again. Columbus never set foot in what later became the United States. He did not discover America. He landed in the Caribbean, he bounced around there a little bit, he did set foot in modern-day Panama, but not the US. He didn't discover America, okay? Why we all believe that actually goes back to Italian immigration and the Knights of Columbus, Italian American Club, but I'm not going down that rabbit hole right now. It's just one of my pet peeves in history. Sorry. Anyway, 2 explorers who encountered our largest empires in Central and South America, the Aztecs and the Inca respectively, were Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro. Cortez ended up conquering the Aztecs, Pizarro the Inca. But we're focusing on the Inca, so let's just dial into that one. And how a handful of Spaniards in unfamiliar territory on a mountain were able to take down the mighty, several million strong, well-organized Inca Empire. Right? That doesn't really make sense. Now, at the time, the Inca were in the midst of a civil war. Really bad timing for the Inca. There were 2 brothers who were fighting over the throne because their father, Huayna Capac, died from smallpox, which is an old world Afro-Eurasian virus that killed peoples in the Americas because they had never encountered it, so they didn't have the immunity to fight it off. It killed anywhere from 50 to 90% of all indigenous American populations, by the way. It's the main reason why the Aztecs and the Inca fell. But back to the Inca Civil War. The Inca had something called split inheritance. When the ruler died, succession was clearly laid out. The older son got all the political power and rights, and the younger son, or sons if there were multiple, would get the money and the property. Naturally, it led to a lot of conflicts. Now, in this case, upon Huayna Capac's death, the older son, Huascar, like Oscar but fancy, got the title. The younger brother, Atahualpa, got the stuff. But you see, Atahualpa wanted the stuff and the title, so he went to war against his brother. Long story short and simplified, Atahualpa won, but the cost was a highly divided, bitter empire, a spent treasury, tired soldiers, lots of destruction. And right after the Civil War ended, like literally right after it ended, that's when the Spanish rolled up. Like I said, really bad timing. Pizarro only had 180 men and 30 horses, but because the disease was wiping out the Inca for him, he was able to take over. He took advantage of the fact that the Inca were weakened by civil war. He had gunpowder technology, which wasn't available in the Americas, as it was originally a Chinese invention. And he managed to weasel his way into Cusco before jumping on Atahualpa and conquering the capital city. And with Pizarro's attack, the Inca Empire was toppled by the Spanish, and unfortunately, it wasn't the only one. The Aztecs, the second iteration of the Mayans, North American indigenous group, Caribbean indigenous group, like the Arawak, most died from the spread of old world diseases, and others were just straight up slaughtered by the Spanish or the Portuguese or other Europeans who wanted to take American land. Those who survived the disease and conquest were enslaved, primarily in Central and South America, and set to work on plantations alongside imported enslaved Africans, and the fate of the continent was sealed. What would have happened had the Inca had more tolerance to smallpox, if they had gunpowder technology? I would wager a bet that they could have whooped the Spaniards. After all, they had home field advantage on a mountain range, but that will sadly just have to be a classic what if, one of history's mysteries. Regardless, still, to this day, Inca mummies are being unearthed. Children, women, powerful elites who wanted to be preserved for eternity. We learn more about the Inca all the time, a powerful civilization with a spoken language who in a little bit less than 100 years built a massive empire over 2,500 miles long, ruling over millions of people. And while their version of human sacrifice wasn't as bloody or violent as the Aztecs or other examples of human sacrifice throughout history, it's still spooky to think of children, like the Llullaillaco maiden, cowering on top of a mountain, waiting to die in service to her emperor. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Inca Mummies. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon or YouTube, so please go and check them out, let me know what you think, and I look forward to giving you more and more content in the future. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.